Play. Okay. Yep. So this talk is going to be recorded from here on out. Okay. So hi everybody. I'm Chris. I'm not important. I'm mostly just here to introduce Andrew. I'm faculty at Northeastern. Some of you may know me, but I'm mostly here in my role as the coordinator for the Games Lecture Series. For which we're happy to have our first speaker is Andrew Plotkin, who I've known for some years now, and is very well known for interactive fiction, narrative-based games, and really tricky but really good puzzles. Highly recommend checking out his portfolio if you haven't. And now works at Molasses Flood, and just as a little side gig that probably takes up a lot of your time, also runs the Interactive Fiction Technology Foundation. So lots of good stuff, and very excited for his talk.
Which you have just given the first paragraph off. Yes, okay, so I'm Andrew. I have written a bunch of text games. For the Interactive Fiction Technology Foundation is a nonprofit, which I'm obliged to plug. I don't actually run it at this point. I'm just on the board, and I handle some of the spreadsheets. I am organizing this year's IFTF conference, which is in Pittsburgh this year. It's called Narrowscope. We've been running this conference for a few years now, and it's about narrative games, narrative game design, and narrative game technology. And it's great, and you should go, except of course it's Pittsburgh, so it's a nuisance to get there, but I have to plug it anyway. I was invited here, I guess, as part of a lecture series on people's different paths into the game industry. I don't actually have a path into the game industry. I mostly haven't been in the game industry. I had one game job like right after college in 1995 and said, oh, wow, I'm getting into the game industry. This is going to be my life. And that got like 18 months. And, a project that you wouldn't believe if I told you, and it was canceled. So I've actually spent most of my life in general technology software development, just in companies here and there, spent a few years at Akamai. But all that time I was working on hobbyist interactive fiction in the online community that started in the 90s following the death of all the text adventure companies. And that was where I got in working on old style, that is to say, Zork style text adventures. The result of that is that of course, when I was in college, there was not game design as a major. That didn't exist. In fact, this is a true story. I was almost in college before computer science was a major. I was at Carnegie Mellon, and when I got to CMU, there was a computer science department, but it was a graduate program. And all these kids were showing up as undergrads saying, we want to learn to be programmers because there are computers now. And the school was like, okay, we have courses, but you're gonna have to put yourself down as a math major and just like right underneath it, you're gonna be taking the CS courses. We'll figure it out. They did eventually figure it out, and and now counts as a CS school, but it was an unusual time. Anyway, the upshot of this is that I don't actually know what's in computer game development courses. And it's possible that when I give this lecture, I'm going to be saying stuff that's already in your textbook. In which case, like, raise your hand and say, okay, grandpa. And I'll switch over and talk about the history of werewolf or like shortbread recipes or something. That's my disclaimer. The other thing about, so I'm going to be talking more about game criticism and analysis than game design per se, because all that time I was not in the industry. I was writing games, but I wasn't hanging out with professional game developers, but I was playing a lot of games and writing a lot of game reviews, particularly of adventure games, not just text adventures, but also graphical adventures and other kinds of games. So I wound up with like more internet cred for, I don't know, more, but internet cred for both criticism and analysis as well as game design. So I thought I would give a talk on some of that. But because I've been, okay. Third disclaimer, I realize this is probably too many disclaimers. Having been doing this so long, one of the interesting things that happens is that you start to outlive some of the really stupid arguments. Like people were talking about some random discourse in game design, and you think, oh God, not that again. And then like after a few years, they're not talking about it anymore, and you realized it's gone. They figured it out, or maybe it became too boring to talk about. But you know, there was a period where people were seriously discussing whether games were art, right? Can games be an art form? And after a while, they weren't doing that anymore because there was too much discussion about the artistic nature of games, the artistic structure of games, and there were games in art museums. You know, the Whitney Biennial had some of Porpentine's Twine games, and the MoMA in New York had an exhibition of video games, and that whole discussion just kind of expired, which was nice because it was really a very boring argument to begin with. But you go through some of these cycles, like, you know, can you have a video game without violence? This was kind of a question when the only game was Space Invaders, but it got resolved pretty quickly. People were writing adventure games that were nonviolent. Can you have a game which doesn't have violence or puzzles? All right, well, sure, there's crafting games, there's farming games. Can you have a game which has no violence or puzzles or goals that you're trying to accomplish? Well, yes, there's The Sims, right? That sold a bazillion copies. Can you have a game where you don't do anything at all? You just walk around and look at stuff? Well, yes, there's, we'll start calling them walking simulators, The Graveyard, the Arrestor, and so forth. So the fact that these games started to exist comprises a proof by construction that all these things are possible, which is good, but it doesn't actually answer the question of what people were thinking of to begin with when they said it wasn't possible. You really want to figure out what the assumption is that went wrong. And you can do that when you start to have the examples. Like if someone doesn't think that walking simulators are games, you can sit them down and say, well, some people think that Dear Esther is a compelling experience. Do you? And they say yes or no. Or they might say, it's a compelling experience, but it's not a game. And then you can say, okay, what is in this thing what is not in this particular experience that is in other experiences? What am I getting out of that you're not, or what are you enjoying but you don't think it's game-like? And you can boil it down to cases and say, well, we may not agree about whether this is a good example, but at least we know what point we're disagreeing about in our definitions, which is helpful. And you can then use that in leverage when you go on to construct your next framework. So we can do this, hopefully, for the headline question that I stuck on this talk, which is the war between interactivity and narrative, which I think I actually put down the great war between interactivity and narrative. When I wrote that, I was quoting Graham Nelson's essay, The Craft of Adventure, which was from the early interactive fiction community hobbyist discussion. And of course, he wasn't saying, what he actually wrote was, an adventure game is a crossword at war with a narrative. And he wasn't trying to make the point that it was impossible to blend these things, because he was writing in 1995. And even at that point, there was a 20-year history of games that were both puzzle experiences and narrative experiences. And his essay quotes that whole history to make the point of, you have to balance these elements. What are the ways that we can bring them into the same game without it feeling artificial? And he had lots of examples. It's a good essay. It's Googleable. It's in the Interactive Fiction Archive, and also part of the, if you read the Inform as a text adventure design language, if you read the manual, The Craft of Adventure is in there as an essay. So anyway, that was the 90s, and people, like I grew up playing the text adventures in the 80s, and in the 90s, those were still very present. It wasn't the center of the new computer game industry, but everybody had at least heard of them. You go on a few years to like the year 2000, 2005, the game industry has become much larger. And at that point, there starts to be more of a tone in discussion that story and gameplay are separated. You can still put them in the same game, but when the story starts happening, the gameplay is pushed aside. And when the player is working on the, like playing through the game, the story is in the background. And some of us at the time, old timers, were saying, well, that doesn't make any sense. There's plenty of adventure games where these things are blended. But at that point, people who had played the game market had become so large that most people were not people who started in 1981 playing Planetfall. Most people were older, and also games were larger and more cinematic. So my theory, and I have not done any research to verify this, this is just my gut response to watching the history go by, is that the expansion of the game industry and the expansion of game industry budgets meant that people were thinking of games as an experience that ought to be cinematic, and were comparing them to movies, and wanted to bring in professional writers rather than just winging it the way the whole game industry had started in the 80s. And when you hired game writers in like 2000-ish, there were no professional game writers because that wasn't a thing. People were hiring professional writers who were screenwriters or TV writers or novel writers. You saw, games that were specifically spun off of Asimov novels, games that were spun off of Star Trek and had, Star Trek writer names on them. The game was credited with story by Orson Scott Card and so forth. And these were people to whom the idea of a game story was a screenplay. Like, what happens is described in a script. It's a series of events. There's camera positions, there's lines of dialogue, it's all played out, and then you go back to the game. Or even there's a screenplay for the entire game, and someone is tasked to deliver it, and they deliver it in it's a stack of paper with a list of everything that happens, clunk, and then they hand that off to the game designers and say, well, put that in the game. The game designers look back and say, what? But I'm not saying the entire industry worked that way. There was lots and lots of variation. There were plenty of good games from that era, but there was, I think, a wave of people coming in who didn't really understand how these things went together. And so for a while, it was assumed that the way story worked was cutscenes, at least in high visibility, high profile games. And cutscene is exactly that. Like, gameplay stops, player goes through some things, some events happens, there's an explosion, there's dialogue, and then you switch back to the game and go back to solving puzzles or shooting things or whatever's going on. So it got to the point, and I've seen this, this argument made, I saw this argument made back in the day, that it was logically contradictory for the player to control the story of the game. Like, every decision in the game has to be made by somebody, and it's either made by the author of the game or the player. And if the player makes that decision, the author cannot. And if the author makes the decision, the player cannot. So it is antithetical to imagine that both have influence on the same event. Now, from our perspective, this is obviously nonsense. But it would be good to figure out why. We can point at games again and say, well, there's a proof by construction that there is more possibilities than that. But you don't just analyze a paradox by saying that there's a contradiction in it. Of course, there's a contradiction in it. You wish to diagnose the contradiction. So roughly speaking, I could just answer the question immediately, and this whole lecture would be 20 minutes, but that's no fun. The wave of game writing that happened after 2000, 2005, 2010 was roughly what happened was the appearance of narrative designer as a role. And the definition of narrative designer is still extremely fluxy because every studio has a different procedure, a different process for building these things. But roughly, a narrative designer is somebody who gets it, like understands that when they're talking about the game story, it's not a series of things that happen to the player, it's a series of things that the player can do. And it's the game writer's job to guide the player, steer the player by shaping the space of possibility and giving them an interesting trail through that will lead through the interesting events and produce a satisfying narrative at the end. We get that at this point. But again, we want to figure out what the contradiction is between that point of view and the sort of logical proof point of view that says that this cannot happen. So I didn't actually get to the point of making slides for this talk, so I'm not going to give a specific game example, but if you imagine a Tomb Raider-ish sort of game where you're in a big 3D room and there's mechanisms and levers and you're trying to solve a puzzle and get out. You ask the player who is playing this game, do you have control of the character? Do you have control of Hovercraft? And the player will say, yes, of course, I'm holding a game controller. This is literally what I'm doing. I'm steering the character around. There's this whole room. I can walk anywhere in the room. I can face any direction. I can climb the walls. I can, swim on the ropes and do the things. So that's like it's not a full three-dimensional, three degree of freedom thing because you're still on the floor and you can climb up the walls. That's still basically a two-dimensional description of where you can go. But within that two-dimensional space, you can move wherever you want. And you have lots and lots of control. A different player may look at this and say, I don't have any control over this game. I don't have any control of this character because I'm stuck in a room. There's no way out. The door's locked. All I can do is sit there. And yes, there's like different places in the room, but they're all equivalent because they're all stuck in the room. Moving back and forth is a trivial operation. My only actual choice is whether to solve the puzzle or not. And that's not even a real choice because what are you going to do? Not solve the puzzle? And so from that point of view, there is no choice at all. And in fact, a third player might take yet another view and say, well, I'm working on this puzzle and there's like a lever down near the front of the room and then there's like a water valve in the back of the room. And so that's two things I can do. If I turn the water valve and this platform swings out and I can get onto that platform and climb up to a different lever. So that person is thinking in terms of what are the available puzzle elements in the room? And there's like 2 or 3 of them. And if you fiddle one of them, then a couple more appear and the meaning of the first one changes. So that is a visualization of the game space, which is the puzzle, sort of the abstract puzzle graph. And you can draw it out as a graph. There's going to be, maybe 5 states, maybe 10 states. Each change in state is marked with a little label saying, I pulled this lever and this thing jumped out of the wall and then I was able to get to a new part of the room. So at any given point, there's like 2 or 3 interesting things you can do. It's not a tree because you could go back to a previous state, close the water valve again. But it's a sort of navigable maze-like state, maze-like graph. So at this point, we have 3 answers to the question, does the player have control over the character? One of which is, yes, I have enormous freedom to move around. One of which is, I have 2 or 3 interesting choices of what to do next. And one of which is, I have no choices of what to do next. The game is forcing me to solve this puzzle. And these are all true answers. And this gives us a bit of leverage on the question of how do we think about player control versus author control. It's useful, although not necessarily quite the same answer, to say that these 3 forms of choice are different timescales. This isn't always true, but you can certainly think of moving around the room as moment-to-moment movement, like which gamepad button am I going to press next? I'm going to take one step to the left. 3 seconds later, move over here. It's very fine-grained control. The puzzle-solving moves, pulling levers and such, is, a couple per minute. It takes 20 seconds to run over there and pull the lever, and then you stop and think about what lever to pull next. The question of whether you get out of the room or not might be half an hour or an hour. And then there is sort of at that layer, the next question is, once I have left this scene, this puzzle scene, where do I go next? Well, in 30 minutes, once you actually solve the puzzle, you're going to have to think about what tomb you're going to go jump into next. So there's a series of decisions on that time scale as well. And the player isn't like stuck. The players are very fluent at switching back and forth between these modes of thinking. In fact, the game is probably going to invite them to switch back and forth between these modes of thinking, because to get over to that lever over there, you're probably going to have to climb a wall or do something. And there's going to be a moment of stopping to say, whoops, I have to pay attention to my footing, pay attention to the gamepad, make a careful jump. And then you switch right back to saying, okay, now I can get to that lever. I can move on to the puzzle. And, if you're in the middle of that, you may even stop and think a moment like, well, this is a pretty good puzzle, but I hear there's a better one up in the mountains. So later this afternoon, I will get up there. So the player has a fluid back and forth view. They're not just like stuck in one layer at a time. They're doing them all simultaneously in their head. And that is kind of the full answer to the problem. There are multiple things going on in this game, and they all have game design attached to them. And some of them, the author has put on lots and lots of constraints and is very much steering the player towards a specific series of events. And in other ones, the author has stepped back and said, you have full exploration, full power to explore what's going on and do your own thing. And all of this is happening at the same time. So this gives us, as I said, leverage to think about the design of lots and lots of games. Not even necessarily action games or games with a game controller. If you're playing a classical visual novel, there's a bunch of lines of dialogue and then a choice. And the choice is probably 2 or 3 lines of dialogue that you can choose. And then it goes on with another round of dialogue. You would see the same structure in one of the interactive fictions from the Choice of Games company, like Choice of Drea. Dialogue, small choice, dialogue, small choice. So at any given moment, you're faced with one of 2 or 3 options, but all of these things have a cumulative effect. And over the course of the game, which might be 2 hours, there's many different endings that can result in a visual novel. If it's a dating sim type thing, you could push towards one relationship or another. In the Choice of Games, typically your character will have lots of possible fates. So you have, in the long-term sense, a lot of freedom to choose different endings and different paths to your character, even though the moment-to-moment layer is very narrow. So that's actually kind of the opposite shape. The Tomb Raider example has a sort of pyramid-shaped choice space with lots of freedom at the bottom, 2 or 3 choices in the middle, and no choice at all on top. But the visual novel has an opposite space where it's pretty narrow at the bottom, but you have lots of long-term control if you think about your long-term character choices. Or there could be, something with lots of strategic choice, lots of tactical choice in the middle. Combat games often have lots of tactical choices, which kind of affect what you're doing from one battle to the next. But maybe then there's a narrowly defined series of battles at the high level, and who knows what's going on at the bottom. So usually, the designer is going to have a balance where some of these layers are highly constrained and some of them are give the player lots of freedom, simply because having variety is nice, and the author wants to exert some control over certain aspects of the game, but also leave the player feeling that they have a meaningful sense of agency. Thus, some broad ranges of choice, some narrow ranges of choice, and hopefully, the player always feels like they're sort of stretching their limbs in the most free range that they have. They're sort of concentrating their efforts on what interesting things can I do in this really rich space of moving around or making character choices or whatever. And they don't feel constrained by the place where the author is providing a lot of steering control. If they do, well, then maybe your game has a focus problem and the player is just like not in tune with the way that you think they ought to be playing it, which is a problem that you have to solve. Or maybe the player just doesn't like solving jumping puzzles, in which case they're playing the wrong game, which is also kind of a problem you have to solve, but you have less leverage on that. So it may sometimes this sort of choice space is represented directly in the game. Very often there'll be a map of some part of some layer of the game, maybe the overworld, maybe a mini map of where you're moving around, maybe an abstract map in a civilization type game, a tech tree or a skill tree in an RPG. This is a representation of one of the choice spaces, and it's certainly one that's going to be on the player's mind if it's important enough to put in the game graphics. It's probably one they're thinking about a lot. But there's also going to be lots of implicit layers and things that they have to explore, things that are completely obscured. It's very common in narrative games to have a layer of keeping control of the a layer of geometry. I'm sort of jumping ahead. A layer of like the way the choice space is shaped, which is not obvious to either the player or the author, but rather dependent on the sequence of events that have happened in the game. And that is sufficiently confusing a statement that I'm going to back up and introduce what the hell I meant by that. We have the idea of the shape of a choice space, and I'm using choice. Is choice space a weird phrase to use? If the high level arc of a story is a series of chapters and it's always the same chapters in the same order, it makes sense to describe that as a line or a chain. And that's where people start to say, oh, that game is linear, you don't have any branching choices. Now that's going to be just one layer of the game. And since we've been talking about the idea of multiple layers, there may well be lots of relevant choice at a different layer. But at any given layer, there could be a straight line of things that happen, or there could be a branching tree of things that happen where the player makes some significant choice and then, they branch out and they branch out. This is, really individualized, even though it's probably not drawn in the game graphics itself. Usually there's not going to be that much, you don't typically make a game by branching and branching and branching and branching over and over again, because nobody wants to write 128 different endings. So then you have the idea of, okay, we'll branch for a while and then we'll kind of bring it back in. And this is what some people described as beats on the chain, or string of bushes, where there's like a whole bunch of different ranges of things that can happen in this chapter. And then you move on to the next chapter and it kind of coalesces and you start branching out again. This is a very familiar structure in particularly in narrative games, but really in all sorts of games. Where this starts to get fun is when you pick out additional variables and say, okay, well, we've had a little scene between three characters and you had a bunch of choices for the dialogue in that. And then you got angry at one person, and this is where the archetypical thing pops up on the screen and says, Fred will remember that. Which is a cliche out of Telltale, but also is, it doesn't even have to be based on a choice. Like in games like Firewatch, there's facts reported by the game depending on what you've seen, what you've done, who you've talked to, well, not exactly what you've talked to, but, you know, things that you've done, things that you have explored, changes you have made to the environment. And these get recorded in a table of not events so much as just like Boolean flags, facts, sometimes. You know, abstractly, this is just a set of global variables that gets set as you move through the game. And then as you're steering through one of these branching dialogues, very often there'll be a little sub branch, which is not under the player's control, but rather, did you at some point in the past have an argument with this person? Did you at some point in the past take somebody's, you know, lunch out of their desk? And suddenly the choice space, which can't really be represented as a branching tree anymore because there's a global variable that jumped in and affected the outcome. And again, this is not surprising stuff. It goes back with lots and lots of examples, but from this point of view, the reason that it's interesting is because it brings in a larger range, a larger time scale choice layer, and injects it into the dialogue scale choice layer. The point is that in addition to having a conversation with the person and having, you know, selecting from one of 3 dialogue choices, you suddenly have to think about, wait, what is my history with this character? What is my history as a PC? What am I steering towards? What scenes have I selected in the past? So the reason that I bring it all up in the first place, and maybe this is a digression, but I like the idea of having the player confront their large-scale tactical strategic choices in the middle of having to think about their low-level moment-to-moment choices. Just like when you're building a Tomb Raider puzzle, you want to put a little bit of jumping trickiness in between the 2 levers so that they have to think about their navigation problems while they're also thinking about their puzzle problems. So this also gets in RPGs, this gets worked out in terms of skills and stats, because you've got a whole skill tree or stat tree. Over the course of the game, you're injecting different injecting experience points to different parts of your character, build up different skills, and this will be reflected right back down into the dialogue part of the game, where you're talking to someone who's like, well, if you had a higher, you know, knowledge of this subject, you would have an additional choice here, but you don't because you spent all that, you know, all those skill points putting into something else. And again, we're just trying to mix layers to make the player feel present in more kinds of choices at the same time. Now, there's another whole branching diversion which I could get off into, which is story-lit game design, which is fascinating, except I haven't actually built any games like that myself. This is the idea where rather than constructing a branching tree of options, you sort of construct a bucket of options and put conditions on them and let the game engine select what's going to happen next based on player's history and all these little variables, which is really interesting. And I love games that are built that way, and I don't understand how to build them that way. But there's John Ingold of Inkle Studios has many lectures up from GDC and other places talking about his games 80 Days and the Sorcery series. And one of the points he makes is that this really is a place where the author has to totally give up any semblance of control over the storyline, not because they are giving control over to the player, but because there's the range of what can happen next is based on so many variables in the player history that neither the player nor the author can really visualize every possibility. So it's the game's job to just narrate what happened and make it feel like it was the way that it was always meant to be. You particularly get a particularly good example of this is Heaven's Vault, which is one of the more recent Inkle Studios games, where you can explore this big nebula of asteroids and discover many things, but you're still going to get to the end of the game, and the game is going to essentially narrate what happened your history through the game and tell it and just make a story out of wherever the hell you were. If you discovered where the robots came from, if you didn't discover where the robots came from, if you met the Empress, if you didn't meet the Empress, all of these things will be narrated in the little storyline, and it'll say, you have found these things, but then you went over here and found this other thing, and this brought you to. And the idea of this brought you to is whatever the heck you did, that's what brought you to the end of the game, the vault. It's really, really well done, and I remain absolutely stunned that such a thing is possible. Anyway, so I bring it up mostly as an example of a shape structure, which is neither a chain nor a branching tree, nor even a branching tree punctuated by like variables, but it's a cloud of anything could happen. Let's just see what sequence went in. Anyway, so I'm kind of drifting away from my original point. I've forgotten what my original point was at this point. Basically, a game does more than one thing. The player is aware that the game is doing more than one thing, and they don't find that scary as long as there is something interesting to do, and hopefully not necessary. It is not necessary for the author to put in an interesting layer, put in an interesting storyline for the player to consider as they go. But if you want to write a narrative game, there's this is how you think about doing it without making the player feel railroaded. I'm distracting myself with Bill's Stranding Rail Stage. It's a wonderful visual image of a continent-sized rail yard, rail train lines that are branching and diverging and circling and falling apart and colliding into each other everywhere, and trains flying all over the place, facing giant monsters. I don't know where I'm going with this. Anyway, you can, if you come across someone saying, oh, that game is linear, the question to ask is, which aspect of the game is linear? Why were they focusing on that layer? Is there something more interesting that the player is doing at the same time? And why is the critic not focusing on that? Because it would probably be more fun to think about the fun part. That's my talk. If there's a shape to my talk, it expires in a cloud of vapor at the end. I don't know, or didn't really bring it back to anything, but we'll work we can with it. There is now time for me to interrogate me on the subject.
Oh, I have interrogations, at least two of them. So the thing you were saying at the beginning about some players have an experience and they say, you know, I have autonomy, I have control, and some players play the same experience, they say they don't. It seems to me that the thing that creates autonomy narratively in a game experience is the presence and density of narratively relevant verbs. If I'm playing Tomb Raider and the story is about me raiding tombs, then I need verbs that let me raid tombs, right? I need to climb, and I need to open,
yes,
and I need to switch and shoot and those things, but I don't need to write, right? You know, that's not part of the story. Me not being able to keep a journal doesn't make me feel a loss of autonomy. If I hit a wall that I can't climb, I do feel that loss. If I'm playing a Sherlock Holmes game, I need to be able to deduce and make connections, right?
Yes.
Those kind of things. Does that track? Because you don't just want to throw in as many as you can. You don't create a good sense of autonomy by saying you can do all the things in this world. Go. You have a choice paralysis and players who feel like they're directionless and the game doesn't point.
Yes, all that is true, and that is absolutely how I think about designing any particular game mechanism. And it's certainly true that if a game mechanism isn't working right from the player's point of view, it may well be because the verbs are wrong. Coming up with the verbs is often the fun part. Coming up with verbs that have fun and surprising consequences is my favorite part of game design. It's not, I mean, I didn't get into it per se here because, you know, getting the advice, and you should also make a good game, is not really helpful to the analysis. But you're absolutely right.
I feel like that for students figuring out what is the narrative, what is the story of your game, and then any mechanics, any verbs you're putting into the game, make sure that they belong in that game. It's very easy for new game designers to be like, well, of course there needs to be shooting in this game because it's a game. And they're like, well, but your game's not about shooting, so don't do that.
And this is actually the actual Tomb Raider series. The most recent trilogy is a great example of this because it's, you know, notionally about exploring and solving the puzzles and discovering the secrets of the ancients. And then, in fact, it seems to spend about 2/3 of the game mowing down armies of moose, and then stealing things from tombs and leaving the tombs in utter ruin because they couldn't figure out a way to channel the player forward, which is better than have the tomb collapse behind you. So you're the world's worst archaeologist after Indiana Jones.
Maybe worse than Indy.
Yeah. But I love the games anyway. So, other questions, comments?
Yeah, so during the whole thing, I was just thinking of the Stanley Parable, just because it has a lot of the like choice and narrative, and the narrative is ever changing depending on which ending you get, obviously, and it has like one of the most clear like decision path things. Like, you know, the first decision you have is, well, okay, the first decision that most people make is left door or right door, and like that whole game is about the choices you make and how that affects story and actually in game design in general. I had a point with this and I forgot where I went with it. Yeah. Yeah, it's gone.
Well, Stanley Parable, of course, I mean, it actually is a parable. It's like, it's a deliberate or satire. It's a riff on all the different ways that game designers like goof with this stuff. And it has fun throwing you into different things where there's a clear game design pattern for doing what you do and then like mocking you for following or not following it. I just replayed the extended edition a couple of weeks ago, and it is entertaining, but you know, the question of whether it's a story is like sort of irrelevant. It's not trying to be that, it's trying to be an in-joke among designers on how you do story.
I think my favorite Stanley Parable story was before the professional edition of it was released. It was at PAX on the show floor. There's a demo of it, and I stood there watching people fail to play the demo for about half an hour because the demo screen said Stanley Parable demo was just a white wall of black text, and people would come up to it and like click enter and wait, and nothing happened. And then finally somebody moved the mouse and it realized Stanley was just staring at a wall that said Stanley Parable demo on it. And that wasn't actually the title screen, it was just a wall.
Right.
Yeah. I had a question. So you were talking about story-led design and global variable. And you may or may not know the game that this story or this question comes from, but when you're building that kind of a complex narrative system, where there's a lot of things that are affecting the game state from outside of the player's field of view, and they interact with things and there's certain outcomes. You have to have some method of discoverability and understandability for the player as to what the game state is and why the things that are happening are happening. There was an amazing, massively multiplayer visual novel that a group was developing a few years ago that failed because they didn't expose the fact that global choices were being influenced by all of the other players. And so no one understood why one time they would go to a place and there would be quests available and another time there wouldn't be. And it was actually because other players had done stuff elsewhere and the world had a dynamic state. And rather than making the world feel alive and dynamic, it just made it feel chaotic and you know, like no one had any control of what was happening.
Yeah, servicing is a problem. I've actually seen people complain about Heaven's Vault and say, well, it felt so smooth that I didn't feel like I ever made any choices because the game did such a wonderful job of explaining the ending based on everything that I had done. I just assumed that I had found the golden path by accident. Like, well, no, you didn't. The person's like, yes, I know I didn't, I know how the damn game works, but it felt very non-agent just because of that. So this is why we get the extra diegetic, X will remember that, extra like stats in your HUD, in visual novels, visualizations of the possible branching paths. So you can go back in and replay the game and find the ones for the sheer non-story based fun of completionism. I don't have any great strategies for this. Most of my games have been pretty heavily constrained puzzle games where you got to the end to solve all the puzzles. And I just have to write an ending which is satisfying enough that will make the player saying, ah, yes, this feels like the ending of a game. I must have solved all the puzzles, which can be done. As I said, I haven't worked on story-led games, and recommend the lectures by the people who have.
I have a question in a completely different direction, which is more about kind of getting back to some of the first parts of your talk, where you're giving some historical and kind of social context for this alleged war. And so something that strikes me, right, is like the language of like describing it as a war, is that in wars there are stakes, right?
Mm-hmm.
There are things that are to be won and to be lost. So what from your perspective were people really fighting over? What were the stakes, and who, if anybody, won?
Well, the stakes were pretty straightforward. Like the narrator, the narrative people, the writers really wanted to have big dramatic stories, which were as emotionally like engaging and powerful as big movies and, they wanted to have characters who were as moving and deep as the characters in their favorite books. And on the flip side, people wanted to play games that felt like playing a big game and you were doing all sorts of things and you had control over what you're doing. And these were, in some sense, I'm using war in something of a joking sense, but the conflict is, can we do these both in the same game? And, really get this player character to feel like the star of a movie, while also having them do all sorts of things that in a movie would be extremely boring, like, grinding XP or exploring 47 tombs in a row.
Yeah, I think that the war ended in an armistice, and it was driven not by mutually assured destruction, but by mutually assured satisfaction.
Mm-hmm.
We had a sufficient number of games of each kind that both sides could agree were amazing games, that it became pointless to make the argument that we can't have all of them, right?
Yes.
I mean, you don't need narrative in Beat Saber or in Tetris Effect for those to be superlative experiences, and the narrativists could look at those and be like, those are amazing games, I love them. You don't need gameplay in Dear Esther or, What Remains of Me or, so, yeah.
And we had, a generation of people who knew how to build games like that. Largely from looking at examples and saying, ooh, I want to build something like that, which is where most people get into the game industry. But yeah, I meant it about there being a generation of suddenly people who were called narrative designers who understood what the hell was going on and could start to make it work in this way.
Right, and that's, well, sorry, just to quickly follow up on that, like, I think, what I was kind of maybe trying to ask a leading question towards was really about the sort of like, when you do or do not classify something as a game, in some sense, it's just an academic argument, but in some sense, it's also about, well, like who gets, hired, who gets prestige, who gets invited to the talk at a game conference, whatever, who gets considered part of the community. And in that sense, I definitely think it's exciting. I don't know if you agree, but to see like the concept of narrative designer to becoming more of an established role in the games industry.
And the kinds of games that are notable in that realm, you get awards. They get presented at GDC. I was super happy with the narrative, the best narrative category in the IGF awards that came out a few months ago. There's just fantastic games in there. and they're getting recognized, and as not just as good games, but the people who built them are doing great things within the game industry and getting influencing the next generation. To influence the next generation, which is why I'm up here casting my spell on you.
I think it's interesting also that while it's often a good choice to blend narrative and gameplay very homogeneously, there are many games that I play and love that are that way. It's not the only choice. It's not necessarily the right choice. If you look at something like Hades, there's a very clear distinction. Yes, there are some narrative elements where you're out exploring the world, but like essentially it's segregated into two halves. And because of the structure of the game, the roguelike nature of it, that really one serves as a reward for the other, and mixing them would have made the game less successful, I think. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think Breath of the Wild also does a similar thing. Where like there's a lot of main story beats, right? Like, you know, there's the divine beasts or whatever. But then there's also like something like 100+ shrines. You don't need to complete any of them to complete the game. Actually, you don't even need to do the divine beasts, but that's another thing. But like if you do the main story, it'll help you if you're just like wandering around Hyrule. And if you're wandering around Hyrule, you're gonna like get some better weapons, and you know you're gonna get some shrines that'll like get extra hearts and stuff like that. So yeah, so I want to give that example.
Yeah, I think it's very clear that the industry at large, and certainly designers in the industry, are aware that like these two things can coexist, but it feels like, to me at least, like the super high budget studios are not like taking that approach, like your Activision Blizzards and those kind of studios. Like, is there anything you want to say?
Mostly I don't play those games.
Okay, that's fair enough.
This is, I mean, I don't, this is a prejudice. It's actually more because I don't like playing very large games. I don't really want to play something that's going to eat up 60 hours of my life. And so I just tend to gravitate towards short games. And this makes it difficult for me to talk about these things, especially because, well, as Chris said at the beginning, I work for the Molasses Flood. This is my day job. And the Molasses Flood is part of CD Projekt. And what my studio is working on is in fact a Witcher game. I work on it as a engineer rather than a writer, so I don't actually myself know a whole lot about The Witcher. Like, I'm not a super Witcher expert. I played a little bit of Witcher 3 to find out what kind of game it was, but the idea of playing that entire game, oh God. Like, it was nice, I enjoyed it, but I just wanted to do something else. So the way things work in the really, really giant studios, even though I am in a pretty big studio, is actually pretty foreign to me.
Yeah, so I know, like, towards the beginning, you mentioned how cutscenes were kind of like very, like, it was before that you're in the gameplay, and then as soon as you get to the cutscene, it's just narrative, and then back to the gameplay, and very like strict back and forth. And like, I just want to know, how do you think like cutscenes, how would you fit a cutscene in to kind of help the transfer between gameplay and narrative? Like, do you even think it's a valid idea to use a cutscene to kind of blend the two together?
Well, I mean, they still happen all the time. They tend to, the way that they have evolved over time is there's more player interaction in cutscenes. That is to say, a cutscene is more likely to be a branching narrative beat where in the middle of it, you get to do one thing or another thing. Also, there's plenty of examples of walk and talk type scenes, games like other ones of it.
I mean, the most recent God of War has a lot of.
Yeah. Where things are like, there's people talking in the background, but when you reach shore, you get off and the conversation is interrupted. You're doing things, you might be just physically steering or walking around while the dialogue happens. You might be like switching back and forth, walking and talking. What was the game from night school that I'm thinking of? Sorry. Were I at home, I'd look it up. But again, it was an adventure style game, but all the dialogue was happening.
Oxenfree? Is that what you mean?
Yes, thank you, Oxenfree.
Yeah.
all the dialogue happens as you're moving around, and you can either like react to a dialogue prompt or keep walking, or like just wait and see what someone else says. So time-based dialogue choices blend into cutscenes if you decide not to do anything. So that's the way that games like have evolved the concept beyond a simple cinematic log.
I think there's also an edge on that with how many verbs there are around the dialogue. In the God of War games, there aren't any. So there's dialogue happening out of cutscenes, but you still have zero autonomy in that dialogue, right? Characters are just talking. You happen to be controlling one of them's body, but you're not controlling their mouth. As opposed to Mass Effect, where every time I get to dialogue, I have a set of choices, or Oxenfree, where like simply not making a choice is a choice, right?
And also, there's been, I think, more emphasis on the player triggering these scenes so that you're actively choosing when to get into a dialogue, what the dialogue is going to be about. If there's different parts in the game, or you're deciding which character to dialogue forward with, then you feel like you have control over what's going on, even though the dialogue itself may be fixed. Anything else? We've hit about an hour. I don't know, are you switching back and giving the rest of this talk, or?
Yeah, I mean, I have we were gonna do our game studio stuff once you're done.
I believe I'm done.
Awesome.
And you're ready.
Thank you so much. We appreciate you coming out.
Stopping the recording on Zoom.